In my experience, when it comes to Ukrainian companies, it's very rare when management is ready for the arrival of a board, and even more rarely top management actually wants a board to come in.
What kinds of challenges have you encountered while working on boards?
I naively believed that if the owners shared common goals for business development, they would strive to reach agreements. But that's not the case. Those who do decide to bring in a board, in my opinion, benefit from it. A board brings that breadth of strategic perspective.
Many owners who implement boards, starting with advisory boards, eventually envision a supervisory board in the long run. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Sergiy Bulavin, and you're now watching the Board of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin. Today we have Armen Kurginian as our guest. Armen, welcome. Thank you. Armen is an active member of the Board of Directors and the Chair of Boards of Directors. And today Armen and I are discussing a career in Boards of Directors. Armen, what made you turn your attention to boards?
Somewhat accidental. I'm generally open to everything new. I think my main motivation at the time was essentially a broad interest in the business environment. And at the time when I got enrolled in Professional Association of Corporate Governance, that's how I got into boards. I was a CEO of a company where the owners and top management decided to establish a supervisory board. So from the CEO's perspective, I decided to familiarize myself with how this process generally works. Then Alexander Okunev approached me and offered a position on the board of a mid-sized company. The company was involved in distribution, and I agreed. I had an interview with the owners and with the chair of that board, Irina Papusha, and I accepted the offer. It was a pro bono position. And basically it was completely fine, considering it was my first board. And that's how it all started. And now it's been 5 years. I've been working in corporate governance on advisory boards, and I'm very happy about that coincidence of circumstances.
And if you think back to that first board, did you have any expectations when you joined it? Maybe some preconceived notions, templates, or formats? I mean, the board's work formats. To what extent did it meet your expectations?
My expectations were very vague, because practice is always different. At that time, what was a challenge for me in that first position was, first and foremost, the format of the board's work itself. That is the very essence of the board members' independence and the format of the dialogue that takes place between stakeholders. That is, between top management, the owners, and the board. That was the first thing. Secondly, it's the need for rapid immersion, because board members often have to quickly get involved in a new business to understand the specific rules of how this system operates within that business, or in that segment, or at that particular enterprise as it currently exists. It's about getting acquainted and becoming part of the team, essentially integrating into the team. That also needs to happen fairly quickly. I'm used to the fact that when changing jobs, a CEO usually needs about 6 to 12 months to understand, especially if it's a different industry, where they've ended up, so to speak, where the coffee machine is and what exactly they're supposed to be doing here. But the board member doesn't have that kind of luxury. You have to get involved pretty quickly. And considering that these are almost always new segments, it's a particular kind of challenge. But that's exactly what drives me.
So, going back to the invitation to your first board, why do you think it was who they chose? What is your area of expertise or the professional areas that were shaped during your executive career? Were they recognized and useful in that first board?
I think it's primarily business development as a general concept, and more specifically, sales and marketing. I've been working in this area since 2006 in various roles, starting from commercial director to CEO. And for the kind of distribution company I joined on my first board, that was exactly what was needed. It was during the COVID times, and it was precisely the commercial policy and overall strategy that were essential. For companies, specifically for distribution companies, strategy is always tied to sales, to finding new clients, new markets, channels of distribution, and so on. That's why I believe that this very focus on moving forward, on growth, on business development, in other words, identifying new business opportunities, is exactly what brought me in, based on recommendations from the Professional Association of Corporate Governance. It led me to the board where I ended up, which was my first position.
After that, there were more boards. So as of today, how many boards have you been involved with?
I've been involved with 5 boards. Those are all the advisory boards, meaning I haven't participated in supervisory boards so far. And now, recently, I also became the head of an advisory board. It's kind of the next step for me. That's exactly how I perceive it. And I think that having experience with 5 boards already, I can share a bit of insight into how corporate governance is generally developing for small and medium-sized businesses in Ukraine.
Right now, you're both the head of a board and a board member.
Yes.
How many boards are you currently working on?
3.
And as a chair? I'm the chair of one of them. What do you think is the maximum number of boards a person can realistically take on?
In that sense, I'm quite limited because a large part of my time is dedicated to execution in the company I manage. But it depends on the board's format. In reality, there are boards that only require participation once a month or once a quarter. I haven't seen any like that yet, but they say they exist. If the workload and involvement are like that, then, of course, the number of boards can be higher. But I wouldn't chase quantity here because you have to look at quality. Times are changing very quickly, and sometimes it might be once a month. But the latest trends, not only in Ukraine but globally, show that boards need to be more involved in operational activities. So I wouldn't rely on limited involvement. I would say that right now, for me, this is working time exceeds all of my involvement by about 30-40%. So it's up to each person to decide how much time they can dedicate to this and how much they can focus, because that's important too. Each board and each company is at its own stage of development, with its own level of the owner's ambition and expectations. Different segments are developing differently in Ukraine. I am on the board of a company whose market, for example, is growing by 30, 40, 50% each year, and that in a way sets one direction for the board and its strategy. There are companies that are going through crises right now, and the level of involvement there is different. So it all depends, but I wouldn't focus on quantity.
Regarding quantity, a lot probably depends on the business industry of a specific company because each unit within the company is essentially a separate board.
Yes, absolutely.
What challenges have you faced while working on boards?
The main challenge is the owners. What do I mean by that? It's the relationship with the owners, it's the owners' expectations. What makes this issue particularly complex is when there are multiple owners, and they may have different views, and that's completely normal. They may see the role of the board as a kind of judge in a sense, or as a buffer that takes into account all the wishes and expectations of the owners collectively to build a unified strategy. But the most important and biggest challenges, even at the initial stage, are the owners' understanding of the board's role. I even came up with a concept for myself, board-ready owners. That is, there are owners who are ready for boards. In my view, this primarily means being open to different opinions, being receptive to alternative perspectives. And there are owners who are not ready for that yet. Transition from authoritarian management of the company, if the owner is directly involved in the operational business, to involving a board and aligning their decisions with the board, following recommendations when it becomes necessary to act in coordination with the board. All of this requires a certain level of maturity from the owners, I would say. Many challenges are related precisely to that.
Well, especially when the owners are at the same time both owners, board members, and top executives.
Yes, in my experience as well, there were 2 such cases. And this also requires a certain awareness from the owners, a conscious attitude toward the different hats they wear. But it's really difficult. I'm in favor of owners still choosing a maximum of 2 roles, because handling all 3 is hard. As board members, they develop certain decisions and then have to execute them themselves in the end and evaluate themselves. So it's a bit like schizophrenia sometimes. It's as hard to get separated.
The owner's readiness is undoubtedly clear, but what about the company's readiness and the top management's readiness to implement a board?
In my experience, when it comes to Ukrainian companies, it's very rare that top management is ready for the arrival of a board. And even more rarely, perhaps, does top management actually want a board to come in. And it's a separate challenge for the board to sell itself to the top management. Not just to the owner, but also to the top management. Why? Because also, if we talk about recent trends in corporate governance, there is more involvement, as we mentioned, of boards in operational management. Why is this happening? There's a lot of uncertainty all around. And planning something while meeting only once a quarter is quite difficult, because over the course of a quarter, basically everything can change. And the board must constantly maintain close contact and communication with both the owners and the top management, not only during meetings. At the same time, top management may perceive this as interference and micromanagement from the board. And this concern has to be constantly addressed. On the one hand, changing circumstances require and force boards to intervene more frequently. On the other hand, it shouldn't be micromanagement. And top management shouldn't feel that the board wants to replace them and do the work instead of them, because that's demotivating and in general mature. Top managers don't like that kind of board, let's put it that way. They're used to being responsible and executing and being accountable for that execution themselves. So it's a fine line. I would say that the biggest challenge is precisely the relationship with top management. But at the same time, without them, the board won't be effective.
Regarding the CEO's readiness, working with the board and in general, the CEO's readiness, real readiness to take on the role of CEO. Because there are a lot of promising CEOs, especially in Ukrainian business. That is, specialists are appointed as CEOs, but in reality they can't truly be CEOs because they lack the expertise, knowledge, experience, and so on.
Yes, this is very common. Very often in Ukrainian companies, CEOs are appointed by the owners. I would say always appointed by the owners. So if the CEO doesn't fully meet the requirements of the position, the reason lies with the owner. For some reason, the owner either didn't notice this mismatch or is fine living with it. This can happen when the CEO is a close person to the owner or has some kind of shared experience in the past. And that's why boards often come in with tasks assigned to them, or they set them for themselves. Or the owner asks to verify whether the current CEO can actually move the company forward, because the owner always has doubts, and that's normal. A very big challenge is execution. It's like a disease within the country. We see it from the very top. It is management dysfunction. Yes, it is management dysfunction. And the CEO of any company, being responsible for the executive power, should be a driving force. That's why boards, when they appear in a company and set certain tasks or ask uncomfortable questions, and boards very often ask uncomfortable questions, they are, in a way, testing the CEO's level of execution. If the CEO is in that position by accident, and that does happen, or simply got the role earlier than they should have, that is, they're still somewhat immature, then it shows up as a lack of execution in front of the board. And that in turn means the board is not satisfied with the CEO, and the question arises whether he or she needs to develop and brought up to speed or be replaced. But if this person is the owner's pick, and in private companies this is very often the case, then the issue is escalated to the owner level. And from there are various possible paths, but changing the CEO in any company, especially one who has been there for a long time, is a challenge, a stressful time. That's why boards, even when they see that it needs to be done, have to approach it very carefully.
There are not many people on the Ukrainian market who have experience in working as interim CEO. You have that experience. You've worked as an interim CEO in several companies. Could you briefly describe that experience?
I worked as an interim CEO in 2 companies, but I have to say right from the start, the very concept of an interim CEO might differ from what we call interim CIO, may differ from classical management. Because in the West, an interim CEO is someone who temporarily takes on the CEO position for a certain period in a company, after which they leave 100% and a permanent CEO steps in. This could be during a period of turbulence or market changes, or something else. It's like a savior, a temporary savior. In my case, it was an experience where we, as a board, would enter companies where the CEO needed to be supported and developed, accompanying them through the entire decision-making process as a CEO. After that, either give a recommendation to replace the CEO or elevate him or her from the position of acting CEO to a full-fledged CEO who, on the one hand, satisfies the owners, because when we come in, there is a CEO whom the owners know and trust, and on the other hand, that he or she also professionally met the expectations of the board. I had such an experience in 2 companies, and it's quite an unusual experience. In one case, it went quite successfully, and this CEO is still working quite successfully for that company, while in the other case, a replacement was necessary.
This is a topic for a deeper conversation because there are a lot of questions, including questions from participants of the Corporate Director course, where I gave lectures and give an example as one of the options, what to do if current CEO does not reach the level of full-fledged CEO. This is an interim CEO, exactly in the form in which you participated in the role of an interim. And in fact, there are a lot of questions. I would be grateful if we could focus on this separately, set aside some time specifically to address this topic. While working on boards, have you ever had to make unpopular or perhaps difficult decisions?
Yes, for me personally, the very essence of being on a board is dialogue. That is, an individual does not make decisions alone. The decision is reached through a process of dialogue. I would actually like to move on to this topic now because I've done a bit of research. What is common between dialogue in the philosophical sense in ancient Greek philosophy and the concept of dialogue in corporate governance? And in fact, there's a lot in common. So did the boards I participated in make unpopular decisions? Very often. And that's absolutely normal, because popular decisions are not always the right ones. Sometimes the owner lacks the courage or the respect for the team, because he or she was the one who assembled and nurtured that team. But as we sometimes say, the board protects the interests of the business first and foremost. And sometimes the interests of the business and the interests of the owner do not align. As strange as that may sound, that's why unpopular decisions are not only unpopular with management and top management, they can also be unpopular with the owner. But the board has to give its recommendation if it's an advisory board. There is an advisory board with expanded powers where the decision is actually made, but the board must definitely give its recommendation no matter how unpopular it may be. This, as I understand it, is the essence of board independence. That is, at a dependence is always decisions pleasant to the owner. It's a warm bath, they sound really nice, there's nothing bad for people in them, but in that case, the board is not needed. It doesn't fulfill its function.
Could you give a few examples of such unpopular decisions? Not necessarily with a relation to a specific company, just general examples.
I think first and foremost, it's about changing people. These are always tough decisions because very often top managers have been in these positions for a long time. And we've replaced quite a few people and looked for new ones to take the place of those who worked on their positions at that time. But what almost always the person selected by the board has a better conversion rate than when one person selects and replaces someone, because there are different perspectives. And again, there's a broader network that can gather recommendations about this person, meaning you can look at them from different angles. However experienced CEO is, but 3 or 4 people with experience will always make better hiring decisions. That's why there are so many such cases, and even now they are still happening. I would say that almost everything is related to changes in personnel,
or due to a change in the business format, for example, when an independent company becomes a branch of another company.
There was actually such a case when a company that operated in Ukraine as an independent legal entity and a separate structure within the owner's other businesses in different countries, at some point, according to the owner's strategy, became a branch of the main parent company in another country, which, in principle, at that time made it impossible to have a board in branches. That is, the board works with the main company. A branch cannot have a separate strategy, even if it's in another country. It must somehow be aligned with the centralized vision of the entire company. And this was a case where the board had to commit a suicide. So I really value this decision made by the chair of the board, because it was a true reflection of genuine independence. That is, a board or another management body within the company focused on protecting itself as much as possible and ensuring its continued existence. Within a branch or a separate company, that's not so important. What matters is to keep working and remain employed. But the board has more freedom in these scenarios. I mean, the individual board member and board as collective body of expertise has more freedom, and the board actually stepped back when the decision was made to get this specific Ukrainian company joined the structure of businesses located in different countries, and thus ceased its operations. And in my opinion, that was as much as possible, for the good, for the benefit.
So the board itself recommended to the owner to make a decision that essentially eliminated the need for a board in this company. Armen, so we talked about the areas of expertise that were very useful in the first board. But overall, if we talk about what soft skills, what abilities and qualities potential board members are useful in order to consider a candidate for the board?
I would combine both soft and hard skills. First and foremost, it's that strategic vision which expands as you gain experience in different segments. That is, even if a person hasn't worked in executive positions but has experience in different businesses, in different segments, it still counts. So that strategic vision also potentially brings them closer to a role on advisory boards. I would also mention working with teams or managing teams. This is about understanding the top management in the companies you're going into. It's about assembling a team in the company where the board operates ideally so that the people fit together like puzzle pieces. And that's exactly why many boards include HR personnel, directors, or someone with HR experience in their composition. That's why experience in working with teams, managing teams, in my opinion, is very important. A very important skill is digital transformation, because many companies are looking at it and moving in that direction. Many companies want to become IT companies, even if they previously operated in a fairly conservative business. Also, it's about risk management, because for a board, it's extremely important to identify risks, mitigate them, and understand how to deal with them time under various circumstances. Sometimes it feels like our entire job is about fighting risks, to be honest, especially lately. And that's a bit frustrating because I'm all for growth, for business development, but instead we have to defend the rear. Critical thinking and basically coming back to the dialogue, understanding dialogue as a working tool for the board and essentially for decision making. And in this sense, it's very important. It's about critical thinking and constructive criticism. Criticism, because it really helps different board members and owners find a common solution that will help the business grow.
We mentioned that boards are a useful tool for business. Probably, besides the benefits, there are some risky aspects that may be associated with introducing the boards. How would you describe these risky aspects of implementing boards?
For example, when there are several owners and not all of them support the idea of boards, the others may see it as a tool of influence and as an encroachment on some kind of monopoly of power. And that is a risk. And that's why it's necessary to always explain and be on the same page with the owners regarding why the board is being introduced in the first place, what its goals are. And the board has to show the highest level of engagement. Another important point, I keep coming back to this, but when it comes to the philosophical dialogue, it's about engagement and interactivity. Engagement of everyone. The process of developing this decision, because then no one will be left out or feel that the board is working against them. Next, a challenge. This is a risky moment. It's the relationship with top management. As we've already mentioned, that is, the uncertainty surrounding it. It requires boards to be more involved, but top management can react quite aggressively to this because it feels like an encroachment on their territory, on their area of responsibility. So one has to be very careful here. If the team is executing well, I wouldn't overdo the operational interference, because this could cause top management to oppose the board. It won't be beneficial for the owner, the business, or the board.
Or shifting responsibility to the board.
Yes, and this is the
same managerial dysfunction.
Yes, the same managerial dysfunction, and that also has a very negative impact on execution, especially because there is no corporate culture, no understanding of independent thinking, the value of independent opinion. A top manager may gladly delegate their responsibilities and functions to the board, but it doesn't work that way because the board is not operationally involved in the company's ongoing daily processes. And it's also very important from the outset to clearly separate the areas of responsibility of top management and the board. What the management is responsible for.
Board, as a rule, operates at a strategic level. If it starts dealing with operational matters, then it's no longer quite a board. It's more of a management function. But if we return to the strategic level, board members often participate in the strategy development and implementation. From your experience, how necessary is the involvement of board members in strategy development?
I think the ideal situation is when the board comes into the company and works on shaping the strategy. And when both top management and the board are involved at this stage, it ensures that the strategy actually works. Why is the board important at this stage? Because, first of all, as we've already mentioned, the board brings a broad, strategic perspective thanks to the diverse expertise and experience of its members. The board, at the same time, while top management, especially the CEO, is more or less isolated in their own bubble. For strategy, it's important to broaden that perspective. The board ensures that the strategy aligns with the owner's goals, because in such creative strategizing, as things can go in any direction, but the owner has their own goals, their own expectations, and the board must ensure that both the development and the implementation of the strategy stay on course and do not deviate from that path. The board helps to test various hypotheses regarding the strategy because, again, there is a diverse network. There are connections in different companies in different segments, and there is the experience of the board members. And strategy is always a set of certain hypotheses about the future. With the experience of the board members, it is possible to look at these hypotheses a bit more realistically, because many have either come through them and have experience, or know people who have done it and can be contacted. And risk management, again, is important. That is, the strategic path, the strategy, is full of risks that can hinder the progress of the strategy, and the board may be able to see them a bit earlier than top management and put some safeguards in place.
And probably, in addition to that, board members have methodological expertise in strategy development because they do this for various companies and accumulate experience that can be useful for another company.
Yes, or by having one experience or another, they can develop some third approach that gives the company something new. That is not to put on someone else's hats in a company, even if it worked there. But all companies are different, just like all people. So, you look, there's a lot in common, but in reality, each person is a whole world. It's exactly the same with businesses, I believe. If you really dig deeper, it's quite a customized story.
If a board is such a useful tool, why are there so few private companies in Ukraine using this tool?
Well, first of all, I think their number is growing, and I see this quite often based on the number of inquiries. I think not all owners are board-ready owners, and not everyone knows about it, and many see it as some kind of risk or a new technology that we're still not very used to. But those who do decide to go for a board, in my opinion, benefit from it. Especially small and medium-sized businesses, which we're talking about. If it's not a supervisory board, in my opinion, it's a very fertile ground for implementing corporate governance because the owners there have certain ambitions. In small and medium-sized businesses, there is great growth potential. That is, it's not a rigid, bureaucratic, large corporation that is like a giant icebreaker, which has a braking distance of 27 kilometers. Medium and small businesses are more mobile, more flexible. So this kind of corporate governance, but with additional involvement compared to supervisory boards, in my opinion, is a great tool specifically for this type of business. I see that the number is growing, and I believe that's how it will continue.
In order to prepare for implementing a board, you need to take a course, maybe learn more about how it works, maybe be more open, ready to accept the opinions of others, including the board. How do you prepare for that?
In my opinion, it's all about practice. What would I recommend paying attention to? First and foremost, institutional training programs like Professional Association of Corporate Governance, for example. From the perspective that there are boards, both supervisory and advisory, in various sectors, a lot is determined by networking. That is, among people or owners who have experienced it. It's a tool for existing board members. And preparing yourself as a specialist, even if you're a very experienced execution officer in any role, whether it's a transformation lead, a chief executive, or something else, boards still have their own peculiarities. First of all, I would talk about broadening the strategic perspective, because I, for example, personally see it as a future opportunity to get rid of that narrowness as a board member. In other words, I strive for a certain universality, because if a person, for example, is a financist and joins a board specifically as a financist, that still narrows things down. It limits both the range of businesses they can join and the functions they can perform on the board. In principle, if a company has a strong CFO, then a person on the board with financial expertise might not need to be involved. That competence might not be the focus. From my perspective, the real value lies in versatility, because it's not so much about depth or having a specific specialty, but rather about specific tasks, which are always temporary and very narrowly focused. It's a targeted use of that person's expertise. Greater versatility is exactly what I mean when we talk about broadening the strategic perspective. This is very important. So I would recommend not getting stuck within the bounds of a single area of expertise or a single field of activity or one business segment, but rather try to understand how adjacent segments work or even completely different business segments, other industries. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's precisely this understanding which emerges at the intersection of different approaches. That, in my opinion, is what creates value for the board.
Armen, what do you see as your greatest achievement in working on boards, or perhaps the boards you've been a part of?
Since boards come in at different stages of a company's development, they naturally have different goals. And basically, if we look at the year 2024, all the boards I was involved in, from the owner's perspective, achieved their goals. That's important. The owner's evaluation is important. I would say that recently, and this was my first experience, but it could be an interesting use of boards. Another possible use of boards is during ownership transitions. If it's a large company or a medium-sized one with complex internal processes, for example, a manufacturing company, it's very important during an ownership change not to lose the team, not to lose the know-how. The company shouldn't face new risks that weren't there before. And essentially, it should reach a stage from which you can already start thinking about further development, about investments, and so on. In 2024, there was an experience, a great experience, for which I'm very grateful to the owners, when the company, while changing ownership, transitioned to a company that was changing ownership through a show board, and which managed to retain the team, to maintain stability, despite how difficult things are right now for manufacturing neighboring companies in Ukraine to continue this work to find new markets for sales. In this, of course, a large part, or the biggest part, is due to the efforts of the top management who trusted the new owners. But the board very thoroughly, in my opinion, went through all the risk areas that the owners could have faced if they had done it on their own. And at this stage, the period of turbulence has passed and the company can now grow with the new owners. In other words, the losses during the ownership transition were minimal, or there were none at all. I believe that this is, I don't know how much, I have limited experience with boards, but I'm not sure how practical the use of boards really is, at least in the broader sense, in the Western world. But I encountered them for the first time, and I think we succeeded.
That's a very interesting experience. Unfortunately, right now M&A deals are not that common on the market. And perhaps indeed after the victory, once the M&A market starts to recover, the contracts parties will look at the board as a way to preserve the business during the ownership transition. Armen, if there were achievements, then surely there were also some setbacks. There were some failures, missteps or mistakes. Did you experience anything like that? And what lessons you learned?
There were a few, I wouldn't call them failures, more like challenges you constantly face or deal with all the time. First and foremost, it's the art of resolving issues when there are multiple owners who have different approaches. And that is a challenge. It's not a failure, but it's a challenge I didn't expect in this format because I naively believed that if the owners share common goals for business development, they would strive to reach agreements. But that's not true. And the board plays a role in this. Despite the company's growth, it plays a significant role. And it was precisely these disagreements that became the reason why board got involved. But I would say that perhaps board should have assessed prospects of this joint management a bit earlier and simply save time. In other words, if before that we were working on bringing the owners' views closer together and achieving that synergy, now we're working on removing the owners from operational management. And so that their differences, when intersecting in operational business, don't hinder the company's development. That took about a year to a year and a half. So we could have been a step ahead, but later on, as I already mentioned, when it wasn't possible to elevate the prospective CEO to a permanent position, which brought turbulence to the company, because we had to look for someone else and we had to do it rather quickly. I'm not sure if this can be considered a failure, because perhaps it would have been worse if the interim CEO had just been covering the impossibility to fulfill all responsibilities in that situation, and then I would have kept pushing him forward and kept getting entangled with him in rough situations. What conclusion did I draw from this? The board should not drag things out and must remain independent. An opinion also implies the timeliness of that opinion. That is, independence and telling the truth to the owners is important, and many owners value and expect that, and that's great. But it's also important to be more assertive in the board's role, and especially to ensure that it's timely, because timing matters for the company as well. Not just the right decisions, but the right and well-reasoned decisions at the right moment in time.
You have quite a lot of experience working both in executive positions and on boards. What advantages does board participation bring to you in your career? You touched on this a bit at the beginning of our conversation. Could you tell us about that in more detail?
On the boards I work on, there are almost everyone I take ASA role model, meaning those I learn from, both as an executive, like a CEO, and as a board member, and I believe that's a big advantage, actually. Secondly, it broadens your horizons. That is, it expands your strategic perspective, including your own business, and understanding which approaches or methodologies you can apply in your own work. For example, after discussing the topic of a BCP plan in one of the businesses, I applied it to the business where I work as a CEO, and things like that give a big push. But probably the most important thing I would say is learning the art of dialogue. Because being a CEO often implies, at least in part, a certain level of authoritarianism. Well, because it's the person who takes responsibility, which means they have to make decisions. And boards teach you to seek a shared perspective, shared decisions, while also collaborating, accepting criticism, which for many CEOs is a challenge. Because a CEO, in principle, makes decisions or coordinates opinions and then makes a decision. He or she can be criticized by the owners, of course, but essentially he's like the king of the hill. Criticism has to be constructive, and you have to learn to take it the right. And this is something I'm developing thanks to this very career.
So you are managing your professional bias related to the executive position?
Yes, and the opposite as well. I mean, I take something from the executive side, or a lot actually, that I bring to the boards because I have this hands-on current experience. And sometimes it helps to understand how a CEO thinks, how they need to communicate things to their teams, in other words, to step into the top management level at some point. And in my experience, that top management is in medium and small businesses. To step into their shoes, that's also very important in order to find common ground.
Armen, how do you see your future in boards of directors? Do you plan to continue your executive career in 5 to 10 years? Or are you perhaps planning to fully transition to a non-executive career, working on boards?
I haven't set such limitations for myself. I plan to keep working as a CEO for as long as it's needed, but I hope that I'll never leave the career of a corporate executive behind, and I plan to continue developing it as well. What kind of prospects are there? If you don't focus on quantity, if you're not chasing numbers, it's very hard to combine that with the role of a CEO. At one point, I thought that a supervisory board could be the next stage, but now I'm not sure about it. And that could be a very interesting topic for our next conversation. I mean, the difference between advisory and supervisory boards. I don't have experience with supervisory boards. It might seem like the next step, but I understand that this experience can be frustrating. Why? Because without direct influence on the business and expectations for specific results, it's either very delayed or very hard to see. Why? Because of the heavy bureaucracy and formalization, and the limited scope of action, and the responsibility of directors on supervisory boards. I always get inspired when I see concrete results in what we do, that is, from specific decisions. I'm not sure whether supervisory boards are the next step in my career or not.
The thing is, from time to time, an advisory board can transform into a supervisory board. And, by the way, many owners who implement boards, starting with an advisory board, eventually see a supervisory board in the long run. Of course, taking into account the experience of Ukrainian companies, including state-owned enterprises, the supervisory board basically is about control, oversight, less so about development. But the more supervisory boards there are in business companies, most likely the more experience there will be in the work of supervisory boards, including in creating added value and developing the business. Armen, what can you recommend to business owners who are thinking about implementing advisory or supervisory boards?
I would put it this way. I would take a different approach. I would say which businesses shouldn't create a board. Speaking about an advisory board, if a business is growing faster than the market and, for example, is meeting all the owner's ambitions. If the business has a stable top team that is committed to growth and demonstrates a high level of execution. In my experience, that's quite a rare case. The company and top management are managing risks. If the company can scale, that is, deliver results that satisfy the owner, not just in one geography or not just in one segment, but can scale more broadly. This is own approach. When a company has a strategy and adheres to that strategy, moving exactly as planned, and is able to make constructive changes, when the environment shifts, I would say that these businesses might not need to think about creating boards right now. But I've encountered very few such businesses in Ukraine, though I'm sure they exist. However, the owner's ambitions are always greater. On one hand, there are the owner's ambitions. On the other, the internal structure of the business can be improved. In this case, a board is necessary. I believe that 95% of businesses that strive to move forward that are not satisfied with what they currently have and have gaps, whether in strategy or in execution, in those cases, a board is needed.
For example, let's take an owner who either independently or perhaps with the help of a specialist or consultant has developed a strategic goal. For the business, he has developed the composition of the board. So where should he find board members? Because when it comes to executive positions, I understand, there are recruitment agencies where you can go, submit your request, and the agency will work on it. There aren't that many recruitment agencies in the Ukrainian market that work with board members. And there aren't that many board members in the market. What would you recommend? Where should owners look for board members?
I would say that there are still companies that do search, but it's more for supervisory boards. So it's more of a formal recruitment process for supervisory board members, which is structured, and very often it's a requirement from the client, for example, the state. In private companies, especially SMEs, I don't know of any companies that are actively searching. I think they exist, but I believe this is a new niche for recruiters and it needs attention. I think the most obvious choice is to turn to institutions that have been in this market for a long time, that bring together experts, that train these experts, that facilitate the exchange of ideas among these experts. First and foremost, for me, that's the Professional Association of Corporate Governance. It has been advocating in the Ukrainian market for many years for corporate governance as a tool for managing a business. And it is precisely there today, I would say, that corporate thought is concentrated. Thoughts about corporate governance. And that's also where many people are, because I hear from the inquiries, people who would like to work in this field. And logically, that's where such requests from owners should be directed, because that's how it was for me. In my experience, that's how I got my first role. And I think that, in principle, this can work that way until recruiters start to notice. Eventually, this niche will be recognized, and they'll start bringing in people with experience, or people with executive experience, or even those without corporate governance experience into some kind of trial roles. Because ultimately, the most important thing is that first experience. In other words, how to get started for the first time. That's the most important part. I would recommend that owners give a chance to people without experience in corporate governance. It's probably risky when the entire board is made up of people who enter corporate governance for the first time, but at least the chair and one board member should have experience. Still, giving others the opportunity is very important.
It also helps to popularize the idea of implementing boards. Let's assume there's a top manager who wants to try starting a career in corporate governance, working on boards of directors. What would you recommend? What steps should be taken to get closer to this career?
First of all, subscribe to Sergiy Bulavin's channel on Telegram and Facebook. I'm serious because the amount of information you share and its usefulness is very well structured. Secondly, it's organized by topic, and it's quite relevant because it's based on current research. So for a person, even one involved in corporate governance, to understand what's happening in this broader global world, not just ours, but globally, it's very useful. I would recommend taking the course, Corporate Director, at the Professional Association of Corporate Governance. But not just to take it and listen, but to really absorb this, the spirit of corporate governance, specifically as carriers of independent thinking, and try to see where one can grow within that. Yes, I'm sure there are various books, different masterclasses and trainings and so on, but nothing can replace interaction with real people. And twice a year there are alumni meetings. That's also very important. It's a really great platform, but it's really just an excuse to meet up. And it's that interaction that happens afterward. This is important. And as I said, my first experience was pro bono. So this is at the initial stage, or maybe even the first and second positions. It can and should be non-commercial.
So gaining experience first and then monetizing it.
Yes, exactly.
Armen, thank you for your thoughts and advice.
Thank you for inviting me.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. See you next time on the Board of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin.